My name is Evelyn Carter, and at 34, I never expected to sit in the very restaurant where my older brother chose to humiliate me. For years, he called me the family disappointment, the sister with a Honda and the wrong degree. This afternoon, his text felt like a summons, and by evening, he leaned back and gave me 8 words that still burn: "You will never afford this place." I did not answer. The owner was already crossing the room. He stopped at our table, wrapped me in a brief hug, and called me boss. The room forgot how to breathe. The text arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon while I was combing through the monthly report for LaRouge Conservatory at my apartment in Fells Point. My brother, Michael Carter. 38 flashed on the screen with a message that read in his efficient bark, "Family dinner, Harbor East, 7:30. Do not be late." My first instinct was to set the phone face down and let the message pass like a gust through the window, nothing more than a change in pressure. I watched the harbor for a beat boats, shouldering through the water, and counted 3 steady breaths until the sting in my chest receded. I have learned to treat invitations from Michael as transactions, not gestures. He does not ask. He summons. For years I mistook that tone for authority. It is only volume. I turned back to my laptop and saved the report. The numbers were clean. Revenue held labor costs in range waist down. Calm facts, the kind that steady my hands. I opened my deal folder and checked the receipts I would carry with me, not to throw like darts, but to know that truth was within reach if needed. The email with the term sheet for the Canton waterfront acquisition sat at the top: $36.5 million for 7 buildings with workforce housing in scope. The board consent template was prepped for DocuSign. A short memo summarized the Carter Hospitality Scholarship Plan for 20 awards this year. On my calendar, the reminder was set for 9:00 in the morning to open escrow with the title company. Each line was a small anchor in water that can run choppy when family is involved. I stood and walked to the closet. I do not wear power like a costume. Power is how you pay on time and how you let the facts breathe. I chose the same black dress I wear when I need to be fully myself. It is simple and well cut and says nothing loud. Closed toe pumps. A light coat in case the harbor wind turned. I slid a small leather folio into my bag with printed summaries in case the room demanded paper. Then I locked eyes with the woman in the mirror and said silently that I would keep my head clear, drink water, and let the data speak when and only when it mattered. On the entry table sat 2 sets of keys I rarely touch for nights like this. The Tesla that moves like quiet lightning. The Aston that still smells like new leather and a dare. I reached for the 3rd ring, the one with the soft fray on the fob. The Honda Accord from 2015 starts with a familiar rattle that feels like a handshake. I prefer not to announce myself with chrome. The drive from Fells Point to Harbor East is short in traffic that has mercy. Evening light spilled over the water and turned the brick facades a warm rose. I rehearsed nothing. I do not script family. I do set boundaries. I will arrive on time. I will not explain my life to be believed. I will not rise to bait. I will leave if the air grows sharp. At a red light, my phone buzzed again. A calendar ping for a board call tomorrow in the afternoon, and a note from Chef Tomas reminding me that the new spring citrus course had tested well. Good. The tiny relief of competence threaded back through my shoulders. I tapped the steering wheel and counted down the green. Memory unspooled of other dinners where I carried the bill and the blame without saying a word. Michael laughed at the Civic and asked if the cup holders still worked. The way our father Richard smiled along because it was easier to let Michael run the table. The soft apology from David later in the parking lot, a hand on my arm and a promise to check in. He is better at promises than following through, but he means well. I do not hold court with grudges. I take notes. I parked 2 blocks from the restaurant by habit. Old reflex learned when I preferred to slip in through the service entrance to avoid ceremony. Harbor East hummed with early dinner energy heels on pavement, a burst of laughter from a patio. I walked the last stretch and let the glow from the dining room wash over me through the glass. Inside my bag, the folio weighted a quiet weight against my palm. If tonight stayed civil, it would never see daylight. If Michael pushed for spectacle, I would still not raise my voice. I would answer only what is asked and let him live with the echo of his own volume. I checked the time. 7:28. On time is on time. I smoothed the line of my coat and felt the ground under my heels. The hostess stand was 10 steps away. Lena was working tonight. She always notices without making a scene. I took one last breath that filled my ribs all the way to my back and tasted the faint salt of the harbor in the air. Then I reached for the door. Warm air lifted from the dining room and wrapped around me as I stepped inside La Rouge Conservatory. The soft clink of glass linen that whispered when a server brushed past the hum of a room that knew its worth. Lena looked up from the hostess stand and gave me that small smile she keeps for regulars who prefer privacy. She greeted me by name, without fuss, and angled her tablet so I could see the Carter reservation glowing at the top. She said the table was ready and that everyone had arrived. I thanked her and followed her through the glow. Michael had chosen a commanding spot with a view of the open pass. He was at the head of the table in a blazer that shone a little too much under warm light. His cufflinks were engraved with an M, and he rested one elbow on the table as if the whole floor were an audience. Our father Richard sat at his right shoulders, slightly rounded from years of leaning on deals, eyes already searching my face for any hint of storm. David sat opposite the empty chair that waited for me, hands folded expression, careful and kind. I placed my bag on the back of the chair and sat. Michael began before I could settle my napkin. He said his acquisition had cleared at $3.2 million, a tidy piece for the quarter, and that the Porsche handled like a dream on the Beltway. He lifted his wrist so the watch could catch the candlelight. I nodded and said congratulations because I believe in naming a victory for what it is, even when it is a parade. A server set a basket of bread with the same quiet I love about this place. Claire the sommelier approached with a gentle confidence that told me she had already taken the temperature of the table from across the room. She described a bottle they were pouring by the glass that night and offered to start a round. I thanked her and asked for still water. I said I wanted a clear head. She accepted that, without even a flicker, a true professional, and poured water for me, while Michael teased that I was missing out on an education. He leaned back and let his eyes travel the line of my dress. He said it looked like something I pulled from an outlet bin, said it with a laugh that asked the surrounding tables to join him. David stared down at his napkin. Richard cleared his throat and said nothing. I sipped my water and let it be. In my head I repeated the rules I had set in the car. Do not explain your life to be believed. Do not rise to bait. Leave if the air grows sharp. Michael asked if my credit card could survive the evening. He said he knew the wine list and that it had a way of punishing the unprepared. He liked the sound of his own voice curled around that word. Unprepared. He raised his hand as if to invite the room into the joke. I picked up the menu, let my eyes rest on the familiar print, then closed it. I told him I would eat what I was in the mood for, and that water suited me tonight. Claire returned with a bottle cradled along her arm and guided my father through the ritual. He inhaled, nodded, and watched the pour with the concentration of a man who prefers signals to sentences. Michael reached for his glass and continued the tour of his latest success. He named the group he courted the hard line he held the discount he squeezed from a vendor who had blinked first. He talked about leverage like it was an heirloom bracelet. The first course arrived in a line that moved like choreography. I felt my shoulders loosen the way they always do when the kitchen in this room begins to speak. A server placed a small plate in front of me with the same care he gave every plate, not more and never less. I thanked him. He met my eyes for a heartbeat and left me with my privacy. Michael turned up his volume. He said the wait list here was 3 months deep and that our father had pulled string after string to secure this table. He made sure the surrounding conversation could hear him. He said I would never touch a place like this on my own dime. He leaned on the last words as if they were a punchline and then let them hang. You will never afford this place. Conversation in the nearest radius paused, as if someone had lifted a needle from a record. I set my water down with care and let my gaze travel past the overhead fixtures to where the light pooled along the wall. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, then settle again the way a tide resettles sand. I did not look at him. I studied the golden wash on the stemware, the steady hands of a server making a tight turn with two plates, the exacting calm behind the pass where a cook wiped the lip of a bowl until it shone. David shifted. He said my name in the way people say a word when they want to build a small bridge. Richard tugged at his cuff and pretended to adjust his watchband. Michael waited for me to flare. He wanted a scene. He wanted a fire that could warm his hands. I gave him silence. I lifted my glass and took another sip of water. The room resumed its rhythm, one measure at a time. A murmur here, a laugh there, the scrape of a chair leg on wood as someone stood to greet a guest. The warmth in the air returned gentled by the promise of good food and a night that could still heal if it chose to. I folded my napkin across my lap and let my breath lengthen until my heart found its regular pace again. Stephen Hale appeared beside our table with the ease of someone who knows how to move through a crowded room without disturbing air. He greeted us by name, thanked my father for joining them again, and asked if everything was to our liking. His eyes rested on me for a fraction longer than courtesy required, not prying, simply taking a temperature. I told him the room felt good tonight. He said the kitchen was excited about the spring menu and that the chef would be sending something shortly. Then he vanished back into the current of service. Michael resumed his running commentary as if Stephen had been on a commercial break. He described the negotiation that made his deal click, how he held firm through a tense call, how the other side caved when he signaled he was willing to walk. He sprinkled in numbers that sounded sharp without context. He glanced around to see if anyone at neighboring tables might be listening. David asked what the integration plan looked like, and whether he was planning to keep the existing staff. Michael waved it off and said the new management team would take care of it. He preferred wins to details. A server approached with a tray and set down the first course for the table. For me, he placed a small plate that did not match the others. A seared fish with a bright sauce I know by scent alone, and a ribbon of fennel shaved so thin it might disappear if you breathed on it. Beside the plate, he slid a card the size of a matchbook. It held 6 words in careful handwriting that I recognized. Citrus, the way you like it. Dessert later from the chocolate you prefer. I tucked the card under my napkin and tasted the fish. The temperature was exact. The acid sang. The kind of precision that makes a person feel seen without a word. David watched my face and asked if I had been here recently. I said I stopped in when I could and that the kitchen was consistent. He asked what I had been working on and whether the scholarship program would open this month or next. I said the applications were nearly ready and that we planned a blind review to keep it fair. He nodded and said that sounded right. His voice had the warm grain of someone who means it when he says he is glad good things are happening. Richard lifted his glass and then set it down again. He said he remembered coming to places like this when he was young in the business, and that it always felt like stepping into a room where everyone knew a language he did not. He started to say more, then looked at Michael and let the sentence fade. The hesitation hovered between us like a small bird that could either land or veer off. I let it be. I have learned to respect the half-built bridge. Claire stopped by with a quiet check-in. She asked if the water was fine or if I preferred sparkling. I said it was still perfect. She refilled my glass and smiled in a way that acknowledged the choice as if it were a mark of taste rather than lack. She turned to my father and spoke briefly about the vineyard behind the wine he had chosen, then drifted away with the bottle balanced at the crook of her arm. Michael noticed my plate was different and tapped the rim with the tip of his fork. He said I must have found the one budget item on the menu and laughed. The server standing by our table did not react. He asked if the kitchen had made a mistake. The server said the kitchen was sending a preparation they believed I would enjoy. Michael lifted a brow and said it figured that some people are just lucky. He made luck sound like something that happens to people who do not try. I took another bite and let the flavor occupy my attention until his commentary softened into texture. The room moved in a rhythm I knew well. The open pass glowed. A cook wiped the lip of a plate until it gleamed. A runner glided past with 2 sauce dishes held like offerings. Stephen returned with the quiet of someone who had timed an entrance to a breath. He asked if everything was tasting right. I told him the fish was perfect. He inclined his head and said the kitchen would be sending an off-menu dessert later that used 70% Venezuelan cacao with a whisper of cardamom. He said the chef had been saving that pairing for the first warm nights. I felt my mouth curve before I could catch it. He seemed satisfied with that and slipped away. Michael kept talking. He liked the story about the vendor who blinked first so much he told it again, this time with a flourish about a coffee cup he slammed down for effect. A server at the next table glanced over, then carefully pretended not to have heard. David asked him how the vendor was doing now and whether the contract left any room for grace. Michael said business did not run on grace. He said leverage again and patted the cufflink with the M as if it could hear him. Across the room, I caught a glimpse of Victor moving along the edge of the dining floor, greeting a couple returning from a long absence. He placed a hand on a shoulder and listened in a way that slows the world around it. He did not look our way yet. He never rushes. I folded the matchbook card into my palm and felt the small weight of ink and intention press into my skin. Richard tried once more to enter the conversation. He asked Michael about the lease on the new space and whether his debt service coverage looked steady. Michael said it was fine and turned back to tell my father a story about a councilman he had charmed on the golf course. The story had a sheen that did not quite cover the thin places. David sipped his wine and let the quiet settle. I kept my eyes on the light running along the rim of my glass. The room felt warmer again, like it was exhaling after holding a thought. The signs were there if you knew what to watch. A manager appears at the right second. A plate that arrived tuned to your palate, not because you asked, but because someone cared to remember. A dessert, promised in a hand I knew. I stayed still and let the current carry me to the next bend. Michael drew in breath, like a man preparing an encore, and tipped his chin as if the room belonged to him. Before the next jab formed, Victor Bellamy was already moving along the perimeter of the dining floor. He cut through the glow with that calm stride I have seen settle an entire Saturday night. He reached our table, placed one warm hand at my shoulder, and pulled me into a brief embrace that felt like home base. He said it was good to see me and told the table that dinner was on the house. Then he called me boss with the kind of ease that comes from truth used often. Sound dropped out for a beat. Then a sharp crack tore through the quiet. The glass in Michael's hand hit the edge and shattered against the floor in a bright spray. Heads lifted across the room, the way birds rise together when a gate opens. A server appeared with a small broom like a magician who conjures tools from air. Claire stepped in to shift the remaining stemware out of harm's reach. Stephen positioned himself just far enough to watch without hovering. No one scolded. No one fussed. The room breathed and returned to stillness. I lifted my eyes to Victor and let the silence do the heavy lifting. He has always been gentle with revelation, but he understands when facts belong in daylight. He addressed my family with the same courtesy he gives to everyone who walks under his roof. He said that in March of 2024, the restaurant stood within days of closing its doors. He said the numbers could not survive one more month of the old agreements. He said I came in after service with a legal pad and a calm face and went line by line through the books. He said I renegotiated supplier contracts, redesigned the schedule so the team could breathe, sat with the landlord to rework the lease, and built a plan that was both austere and kind. He said that before the bank's cutoff, I wired $3.1 million to bridge the gap and restart the engine. He said I now hold 55% of La Rouge, and that the house we were sitting in was standing in large part because I would not let it fall. The words did not land like a trumpet. They settled like truth offered with clean hands. I watched them cross the table and find each man where he sat. David's mouth softened into what might have been a question, then closed again as he recalibrated. Richard's eyes found mine and stayed, not searching for a trick this time, simply looking like a man who has stumbled into a room of his own house and discovered a window he had never opened. Michael stared at the shards at his feet, as if he could put them back together by will alone. Victor rested a palm against the back of my chair and spoke to the room with his eyes, the way he always does when he needs everyone to understand that all is well. He thanked Stephen for the quick hands nodded at Claire and told the busser that everything was fine. Then he asked my father if the meal was to his liking. Richard said it was, and his voice came out softer than I have heard it in years. I felt no triumph. It was not a victory lap. It was relief threaded with something quieter, the reassurance that a story can be told without raising a single decibel. In my head, I saw that night last March, the dining room dark, the candles cold, Victor and I at a side table, with a pot of coffee that went from hot to bitter. I could hear the scratch of my pen as we circled numbers that needed to move and drew arrows through expenses that could be trained to behave. I remembered calling the bank before 5 and watching the wire confirmation hit my inbox. Not a miracle, just arithmetic with a backbone. Michael finally looked up. He adjusted one cufflink with the M, then the other. He said nothing. The bright gloss of his blazer had dulled by a shade. He reached for a napkin, not for his mouth, but as if he needed something to hold. David shifted and placed his glass down gently, as if announcing to no one in particular that he would rather feel the table under his palm than make more noise with Crystal. I thanked Victor without words. He has never required them from me. He told us to enjoy the evening and that the kitchen would continue to send the best of spring. He squeezed my shoulder once and went to greet an older couple by the window who rose when they saw him coming. The soft din swelled again, respectful and curious and kind. The open pass glowed. A bell rang. The next course cued like a promise. I let my breath out slowly and steadily. The room had changed shape and somehow kept the same temperature. I reached for my water and felt the cool of the glass against my fingers. Then I set it down and waited for what would come next. The hum of the dining room steadied again, polite curiosity smoothing into ordinary conversation. I kept my hands folded on the linen and let my pulse settle. From the far side of the room, a woman I knew by reputation and a handful of long meetings crossed the floor with the deliberate grace of someone who dislikes fanfare. Marjorie Blackwell did not stop at the head of the table or plant herself like a flag. She came to my chair, laid 2 fingers lightly against my forearm in greeting, and said in that warm, low register that she was glad to see me in one piece and off a plane for once. She thanked me for the introductions I had made last year, when capital was skittish and nerves were thin. She said 3 of her companies had found a way through because doors opened at the right moment. She nodded toward my family and added that I had a talent for noticing a weak beam before the roof sagged. Then she said she would see me on Tuesday to review the outlines for Singapore, and that her team had sent the latest numbers to my office an hour ago. She did not linger. She gave a small smile to Stephen, a nod to Claire, a quick line of praise to the captain as he passed, and moved on to greet a couple she clearly knew from a different life. Her wake carried no perfume of performance. It smelled like competence and a good rain. Michael's jaw slanted and then reset. His fingers found the cufflink with the M and pressed the face as if to make sure the letter was still there. He kept his eyes on the table, then on his glass, then on the door through which Marjorie had disappeared. Whatever he was about to say swallowed itself and sat quiet. David looked at me with that half smile he has when he is both proud and a little stunned. Richard leaned back and let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He did not look away from me. The next beat belonged to the kitchen. Chef Tomas appeared in front of the house with a white linen folded over his wrist and that rare small grin he saves for nights when the line hums in tune. Beside him walked a young woman with her hair pulled back in a practical knot and eyes that carried more determination than years. Tomas introduced her as Sana Ahmed. He said she had come through the scholarship program and had just finished a tough block at the Culinary Institute. He said he had offered her a chance to train on the cold side and rotate through pastry this spring as a sous chef in practice if she held her own. He patted her shoulder once and stepped back to give her space. Sana looked at me like people do when they want to say too many things at once and are trying not to say any of them too loudly. She thanked me without ceremony. She said the scholarship took a weight off her mother and gave her room to work 2 jobs instead of 3. She said Chef told her to keep her head down and her station clean, and that was exactly what she planned to do. Her voice trembled once and then found its footing. I told her the same thing I tell every young cook who walks into a room like this. Learn the names of the dishwashers first. They will save you more times than you can count. She laughed a quick soft sound, and Chef nodded like a man who approves of a simple truth. Stephen glanced at me for permission to take a quick photo for the staff board in the office. I lifted my hand in a small go-ahead. No flash. No theatrics. 2 seconds and done. He thanked us and guided Sana back toward the kitchen where the bell chimed and a station called for hands. The moment closed gently like a door eased into place so it would not rattle. Michael had nothing ready. The little engine he runs on applause coughed and went silent. He picked up his water and set it down. He smoothed a non-existent wrinkle at his cuff. He tried on a smile that did not fit and let it fall off his face. David leaned toward him and asked a practical question about how he was handling payroll timing during the transition of his new acquisition. Michael said the new management team had a plan. The answer sounded like a card he had not read yet. I did not fill the quiet. I have learned that silence does its best work when left alone. Claire stopped by to refresh my glass and mentioned in passing that the dessert chef had in mind would arrive at the right time. Her phrasing made me smile. The right time is a language this house speaks well. Richard turned his fork in his hand and studied the curve like it might teach him something about balance. He said the room felt different tonight. Less like a stage and more like a home where good manners mattered. He caught himself and looked down, surprised to hear his own voice say out loud what he usually keeps folded behind his ribs. I let his words land where they wanted and did not try to catch them. The table breathed together for a few beats. In the corner, a server cut a candle wick that had grown too long. By the pass, a cook lifted a plate to eye level and checked the sheen on the sauce. At the door, a couple in their 60s came in out of the evening and shook off the chill with the pleasure of people who have been coming here long enough to have a favorite corner. The room held steady. I rested my palms on the linen and let my shoulders drop the last inch. I did not need to add to what had just been said by other people. They had done the talking for me, and done it better than I would have. I believe in giving quietly and working with discipline. Some nights that is enough. A figure stepped to the edge of our table with the polite hesitation of someone who knows timing is part of service. Stephen introduced Grant Lawson and said he would give us a moment in the side alcove so dinner could continue without interruption. Grant carried a slim folio and a tablet and the calm of a man who has walked clients through late-night paperwork more times than he can count. I stood and my family rose a little with me the way people do when they are not sure whether to follow. I told Stephen a quiet thank you, and we moved to the small console near the window where the light was soft and the room felt private without being hidden. Grant opened the tablet and pulled up the term sheet for the Canton waterfront acquisition. 36.5 million 7 buildings, workforce housing, and scope a schedule that respected the realities of city review. He walked me through the key points in a voice pitched to be heard without carrying. Board consent in template form. Escrow instructions prepared. Title search. Ordered upon execution. He confirmed that notarization, if required on any ancillary documents, would be handled off-site tomorrow. He handed me a stylus and turned the screen toward me. My name sat ready where it needed to. I read it again, then signed. I tapped to sign and watched the blue check bloom at each mark. Grant cued the board consent for DocuSign and routed it to the officers in sequence. He said the title company would open escrow at 9 in the morning, that we could expect a preliminary title within 10 to 15 days, and that closing would move only when those steps cleared. I nodded. He asked if I wanted a printed copy tonight. I said the digital trail was fine and that he could send a courtesy summary to my office in the morning. When we returned to the table, I kept my voice even and low. I told my family that what we had done was an approval in principle. and that the real work starts when the escrow opens and the title comes back clean. Richard inclined his head and folded his napkin with new care. David asked if he could help with any municipal coordination, and I told him we were in good hands with the city planning team. Michael did not speak. He watched the tablet disappear into Grant's folio like a stagehand, seeing a prop leave the scene. Claire arrived as if she had been listening for the click of a signature. She presented a thoughtful choice for a quiet toast, not a showpiece, something elegant and restrained. She poured a small measure for each place setting and left my glass at a whisper below the line. I lifted it, let the citrus lift touch the air, and took a single polite sip. Water carried the rest. Claire read the room perfectly and smiled toward Stephen before she stepped away. Grant thanked me for the efficient review and took his leave the way good counsel does without stealing focus. Stephen reappeared and asked if we needed anything altered in the pacing of the meal. I told him the timing felt right and that we were comfortable. He nodded and slipped through the same seam in the evening he had used all night, closing it behind him without a ripple. Chef Tomas arrived a moment later with a small tasting spoon balanced on a saucer. He said the line had a little fun with the staff meal and wanted my opinion. A spring pea veloute, bright green and silken with a hint of lemon oil and chive, sat in the curve of the spoon. I tasted it and could not stop smiling. It was clean and generous, the kind of comfort that respects the person eating it. I told him it would make the team happy after a push. He said that was the point. Then he touched the back of my chair in approval and went back to the pass where the bell chimed twice in quick succession. The table seemed to exhale as one. Richard asked David a question about a case that had been weighing on him. David answered in that steady way he has when he wants to lower the temperature in a room. Michael rolled the cuff of his blazer once and left it there, his fingers finding a neutral place on the linen. He glanced at my water and at the small amount of wine that remained in my glass. I kept my hand around the cooler one. The dining room had found its rhythm again, and with it I found mine. The paperwork was where it belonged in a pipeline with dates and names attached. The celebration remained appropriately small, a nod to the work done and the work to come. The spoon from the kitchen had done its gentle job reminding the table that not everything is a contest, and that care can be tasted. I rested my palm on the saucer and felt the heat it had held, then let it go and returned my attention to the evening waiting in front of us. I reached into my bag and felt for the slim folder I had brought out of habit more than intention. Linen met paper as I laid a single page on the table between the bread plate and Michael's perfectly centered silverware. The heading on the page named the landlord as Tidewater Office Partners, LLC. The address was the same building where his company kept its glass-walled suite and espresso machine that hissed like a show horse. My name was nowhere on it. That is the point of quiet ownership. The ink spoke plainly about obligations that come with space and light, and the right to put your name on the directory. Michael stared at the page and then at me. I told him the lease carried covenants that mattered even on nights when the food was good and the room was soft. Debt service coverage ratio at the level we both know. Quarterly financial reporting due on time. Compliance language that does not care about anyone's mood. Stephen had the sense to drift a few paces away far enough to give privacy without making a scene. Claire refreshed my water and left a line of bubbles clinging to the glass like tiny bells. I slid a second sheet forward. It was a summary prepared by my property team because I like to see numbers when feelings get loud. The last 2 quarters showed stress that could be solved with discipline, but not with speeches. Receivables stretched past comfort. Payroll for the new unit loaded in before revenue had a chance to catch up. Vendor terms squeezed to a point where a late delivery could ripple through a month. I told Michael that I believed he could fix this if he chose to, and that the lease provided a cure period of 30 days before any default would trigger remedies none of us would enjoy. He did not explode. He looked at the numbers and then at the cufflinks with the M, and then back at the numbers. He asked if this was a test. I said it was a contract. He asked if the landlord knew him. I said the landlord knew the lease. His jaw shifted and then loosened. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the page as if the pressure might blur the words. David leaned in and spoke in the voice he uses in conference rooms when he is trying to help two sides find the same sentence. He told Michael to accept the grace that is written into well-made agreements. He said a cure period is not an insult, it is a handrail. He offered to connect Michael with a cash flow consultant he trusted for tough quarters. He said the first step was to stop pretending the numbers were fine. Richard lifted his eyes from the silverware he had been turning in his hands and let them rest on me. When he spoke, the words sounded like they had been waiting a long time behind his teeth. He said perhaps he had not been fair to me. The sentence tilted and wobbled, and then settled on the table between us. He looked at Michael and then back at me and for once did not look away. I told Michael again that he had 30 days to cure. I said I would hold him to the same standard I would hold any tenant, no more and no less. I said that if he needed a list of steps, I would have my team send a plain language memo in the morning. Cut discretionary spend. Fix billing lag. Renegotiate one vendor who would take a longer term in exchange for a small concession now. Sequence payroll so that it matches revenue. It was not magic. It was work. He nodded once. The nod was small and real. It hit something in my chest I had not planned for. The room which had been listening with its shoulders softened around the edges. Stephen passed by and redirected a runner so a plate would not collide with a chair back. Somewhere near the kitchen the bell rang, and a laugh followed, the kind of laugh that means a dish landed just right. Michael asked if the identity of Tidewater mattered tonight. I told him no. I told him the only thing that mattered was whether he wanted to put his company on steadier ground. He looked at David, and then at our father, and then at me. He said he heard me. He did not thank me. He did not apologize. He heard me. For our family, that was a different kind of fireworks. Richard cleared his throat and reached for his glass, and then changed his mind and set his hand flat on the linen instead. He said he would like to see the memo too, not because he doubted me, but because he wanted to understand the work behind a steady house. His voice did not carry beyond our table. It did not need to. I gathered the pages and slid them back into the folder. I did not press the point. I have learned that change does not like to be shoved. It prefers a clear path and a light on the steps. I placed the folder beside my plate and folded my hands. The dining room moved around us in its practiced rhythm, a room that knows how to hold a moment without breaking it. I let the quiet stand and waited for the next course to find our table. A man in a dark suit paused at the edge of our table with the careful posture of someone who respects a dining room. Stephen stepped in half a beat ahead of him and set the stage with that light touch he uses when he wants the boat to glide rather than rock. He introduced Daniel Price from the City Planning Commission and said he would be brief. I stood just enough to be polite. Daniel greeted my family by name, then placed a slim envelope on the table near my water. He said the commission had scheduled the first public hearing for the Canton waterfront proposal, and that notice to interested parties was being served tonight as a courtesy, since several stakeholders were present. I slid the envelope closer and skimmed the top page. The hearing date sat plain in the center of the paper next Wednesday morning at City Hall. Written comments due in 5 business days, staff report available the day before. The words were clean and unsurprised. Daniel kept his voice low and even then offered a card for follow-up. Stephen guided him a step back so he could leave without drawing eyes. It was neat work. The room barely stirred. At the bar, a woman turned on her stool and watched us with the amused patience of someone who has been waiting to be invited into a story. Carolyn Whitaker wore a tidy blazer and the kind of pearl studs that sit like punctuation. 55 if the light was honest, posture-perfect hands, wrapped around a club soda like a prop. I knew her face from neighborhood meetings that stretch long and repeat themselves. She lifted her glass in a gesture that was not unfriendly and then turned back to her companion. She did not approach. Stephen made sure of that, drifting through the space between us with a tray that did not need to be carried at that exact moment. I laid the notice flat so my family could see the heading. I told them the project was designed for the people who make restaurants run, line cooks who finish after midnight and still face a long drive. dishwashers who stand all shift and then ride 2 buses home, servers who hold 3 jobs and spend too much of their pay on rent that eats and eats. I said the units were aimed at households spending more than a third of income on housing and commuting more than an hour a day. I said we had data that mapped those commutes like a bruise around the harbor. The numbers do not raise voices. They do not need to. My phone buzzed once against the linen. A text from Deputy Mayor Alicia Brooks slid onto the screen and sat there like a steadying hand. She confirmed that her office supported a fair process and that staff would be ready to brief the Commission on workforce housing impacts. No confetti, just a clear lane. I felt my shoulders ease a notch. Michael glanced at the bar and then at the paper. He recognized Carolyn from a fundraiser where everyone wore names and smiles. His mouth opened, then closed. For once, he did not turn the room into a stage. David leaned toward the notice and asked about the parking variance in a voice that sounded like the start of a real conversation. I told him the application included a transportation plan that favored late-night safety and partnerships with nearby lots. Richard listened with the careful attention of a man who knows when not to pretend expertise. Across the room, Claire refreshed a table and nodded at Stephen. The staff moved in a pattern that absorbed small disruptions and gave back calm. Victor did not appear. He did not need to. The house knew what it was doing. Carolyn looked our way once more and measured the distance. She did not rise. She turned back to her glass and let the evening be what it was. That restraint felt like a gift. I do not like to bend the dining room around my work. The right place for argument is a hall built for it. I told my family that if they wanted to understand the heart of the project, they should come to the hearing and listen to the prep cooks and bussers who planned to speak. I said the plan was not perfect and never would be, but it was an honest step toward keeping the people who feed a city within reach of the stoves they tend. I said the commission would ask hard questions. I said we had answers and data and a willingness to improve. Stephen returned with an ease that made space for a gentle transition. He asked if we needed a pause in courses or if the pacing felt right. I said the pacing was good. He thanked us and disappeared toward the pass where plates were landing with quiet pride. The room held its temperature. I folded the notice and placed it back in the envelope. I slipped the envelope into my folio and set the folio beside my plate. Then I said the only sentence that belonged in that setting. We will see everyone at City Hall. After that, there was nothing more to add. The next course arrived, and the evening moved forward on its own legs. Stephen appeared at my shoulder like a tide change and said a guest in the hallway wished to speak with me for a brief moment. He offered to hold our course on pacing. I rose and asked Michael and David to step out with me. Richard stayed a hand on his glass, but not drinking. The hallway outside the dining room was a thin river of quiet with framed black and white photos of the harbor in older days. A woman waited near the service door, shoulders squared, eyes steady in a way that told me she had rehearsed this in her car. She introduced herself as Rosa Martinez, 41, a manager with a boutique hotel group tied to the partner on Michael's $3.2 million acquisition. She did not spill words. She placed a small folder in my hand and asked if there was a place where we could talk without people passing. Stephen led us to a short alcove that held a coat stand and a narrow bench. He stood a respectful distance away. I opened the folder and found copies of timesheets that did not match pay stubs, text messages from a supervisor instructing staff to clock out and finish a turn-down round, photographs of an exit blocked by banquet chairs, chemical storage without proper labels. Rosa said she had raised these issues with her regional director and had been told to be a team player until the new owner settled. She said a coworker had slipped near the unmarked mop bucket last week and gone home with a bruised hip and a warning not to make trouble. Her voice did not tremble. It was firm the way a bridge is firm. I asked how long this had been going on. She said long enough to know it was a pattern and not a bad day. David read the pages with the particular stillness he uses when the facts are the only safe thing in the room. Michael stared at the photos, then at Rosa, then at me. I told Rosa that retaliation is illegal and that she should preserve everything as it is. I said there are channels for wage complaints and for OSHA concerns, and that I could connect her to counsel who handles this work without cost to her. I asked if she wanted that help. She nodded and said yes before her mouth finished the word. I texted my pro bono team lead and asked for an intake call first thing in the morning. I added a request for a short primer on next steps that Rosa could carry home tonight. David offered to coordinate a neutral call with a Department of Labor contact so that information could move without confusion. He said he knew the difference between advocacy and interference and would keep his lane. Rosa looked relieved in that quiet way people do when a door opens to a well-lit hallway. Michael asked which property in the portfolio these documents described. Rosa named the one that had given him the margin line he liked to quote. He ran a hand over his jaw and let it drop. He asked if the pictures were recent. She said yes. He asked if the instruction to work off the clock came from the person whose signature was on his new operations agreement. She said yes again. I told Michael that this was not a side story. I told him that if he did not cut ties or fix it now, the lease covenant and his debt service coverage would feel the weight. I said vendors will not remain patient when headlines sniff around. I said numbers move when trust moves. There was no heat in my voice, only arithmetic. He swallowed like the first bite after a long fast. He said he needed to fix it. His eyes did not lift to the ceiling or the door or anyone else for rescue. He kept his eyes on the folder. It was the first sentence of its kind I had heard from him in years. David did not smile. He said good. He said the plan would need timestamps and not adjectives. Rosa exhaled a breath she had been holding since she walked in from the street. She asked what she should do tonight. I told her to go home, write down everything she remembered while it was fresh, send copies only to the attorney team in the morning, and take care of herself. Stephen appeared with a glass of water that was suddenly exactly the right thing. Rosa drank, nodded, and said she would be ready for the call. I handed the folder back to her and said that the first step was already done. She had told the truth in a place that could carry it. She thanked us and left by the side door so she would not have to pass through the dining room like a headline. Stephen watched her go with the respect he gives to anyone who carries weight well. Michael asked how fast he needed to act. I said now. He did not argue. David said he would draft an outline for the morning and send it to both of us. We stood in that narrow space for another breath and let the quiet rearrange itself. When we returned to the table, the next course had not landed yet. Richard looked at our faces and chose to wait for words rather than guess. I took my seat and placed my hands on the linen. The room held steady like a ship that knows how to ride a change in wind. Elaine Porter arrived with the quiet presence of someone who understands family rooms and long tables. Stephen guided her to us and set a small leather folder near my plate. Elaine greeted my father by name and nodded to my brothers. She said she carried a copy of my mother's letter of wishes from the trust file written in the spring of 2018 and thought tonight might be the time to share it. I slid the top page free. My mother's handwriting filled the first lines in a careful script copied for clarity. The letter asked her children to respect one another's paths, even when those paths did not resemble the map our father had drawn years ago. The letter carried a note to me that read in its measured cadence that approval should never be chased at the cost of my own well-being. I felt the words settle along bones I have reinforced over time. Elaine pointed to the last paragraph that asked for kindness without enabling and courage without punishment. She said the letter held no legal force and did not change the trust, but families sometimes anchor to words that law does not measure. David took the copy and read with that stillness he has when he treats paper like a person speaking. His eyes lifted wet. He set the page down with a careful palm. Michael watched his face and then watched mine and stayed quiet in a way I had not seen since we were young. Richard reached for the letter and took it like a man touching a relic. He read the first lines, then the last, then returned to the middle where the note to me sat like a folded hand. Color drained from his face. His breath shortened. He said he needed a second, and his voice clipped the edges of the words. Stephen noticed before the rest of the room did. He touched the back of my father's chair and signaled to the captain. Within a minute, the building security officer with medical training arrived with a small kit. He asked permission to check vitals. My father nodded and tried to smile. I moved the plates enough to make room and asked Stephen for water without ice. The officer wrapped the cuff and called out numbers in a calm tone. Blood pressure is elevated but not hostile. Pulse fast but steadying. No chest pain. No dizziness now that he was seated back. The officer asked about history. I answered from memory while Richard caught up to his breath. I asked the officer to wait while I reached my father's insurance card. I keep photos of essentials where I can find them. I sent a message to my father's primary care through the portal requesting a next-day appointment and flagged it as urgent. I called the after-hours line and left a concise summary with numbers and a callback request. Elaine stayed near but not close. David moved to my father's left shoulder and spoke in a voice that belongs to nurses even though he is a lawyer. He asked if Dad felt pain or pressure. Richard shook his head and said he felt embarrassed more than anything. The officer suggested sitting quietly and monitoring for 10 minutes. He offered an ambulance if symptoms returned. Richard declined transport. He signed the form with a hand that had stopped shaking. I arranged a car for my father for after dinner with a driver I use when discretion matters. I added a note that he might need assistance to the door. I texted his neighbor who often checks on him and asked if she could stop by tonight. I kept my voice even while I lined up these small pieces. They are the kind of pieces that build the bridge between crisis and the next ordinary hour. Richard placed his hand over mine on the table linen. He held it like a person who has run out of ways to pretend and found the ground. He said he had been wrong about me. He said it in words that carried no defense and no explanations. I let them land and did not try to dress them up. I told him I would listen and that I would not trade my boundaries for his comfort. He nodded. Relief moved through his face like a tide pulling back from a line of rocks. The officer signed his notes and stepped away. Stephen reset the table with the same grace he uses for anniversaries and storms. He asked if we wished to pause the meal. I said the pacing could continue as planned. There was no need to turn the room into a waiting room. Claire refreshed my water. The glass looked almost new. Elaine gathered the letter and slipped it back into the folder, then left a clean copy for each of us. She said she would check in tomorrow and that the office could coordinate any documents we might need. She placed a card by my father's plate and rested her hand on the chair for a beat. Then she excused herself with a small smile that said she had watched many families learn how to stand in a new shape. My father kept my hand for one more breath and then let it go. He sat a little straighter. David sat back and pressed his palm flat to the table as if to feel wood that would hold. Michael watched all of this with an expression I could not read yet. The dining room went on with its evening. A plate landed at the next table, and someone laughed softly. The bell at the pass chimed once, and the door to the kitchen swung open and closed like a heartbeat. The week unspooled in firm steps rather than fireworks. On Wednesday morning, City Hall smelled like old wood and coffee gone cold. The hearing room filled with cooks in clean jackets and dishwashers in pressed shirts and servers who had traded their aprons for blazers for an hour. Daniel Price opened with a staff summary that was dry in a useful way. I sat with my folder and let the testimony do its work. A prep cook spoke about getting home after 1 a.m. and catching a nap on a bus seat. A dishwasher described rent that swallowed more than a third of pay and still asked for more. Carolyn took her turn with concerns about parking and noise. Alicia Brooks balanced the scale with data on commuting patterns around the harbor and the reality of wages. When the commission voted, it did not feel like a miracle. It felt earned. Approval with conditions. A parking variance tied to a written plan that uses nearby lots at night and safe transport after late shifts. A set percentage of units pegged to area median income with deep affordability at 60%, and a portion at 80% locked by a long deed restriction. Quarterly reporting to the Commission for the first 2 years to prove the promises made in public could hold up under light. We exhaled as a group without cheering. I shook hands with people who would one day sign their first lease and sleep 20 minutes from their station. Outside, the sky was the color of a clean plate, and the breeze smelled like the harbor after rain. The second thread moved faster than anyone expected. Rosa's intake call with counsel started early the next morning. By afternoon, her folder had become a neat packet with exhibits and a timeline that could stand on its own. The hotel group sat down with their lawyers before the weekend and agreed to pay back wages for overtime, adjust schedules, and bring in a safety consultant to audit storage and egress. They signed a settlement that required training and posted notices in break rooms where nobody could miss them. The Department of Labor contact logged the case and set follow-up dates with a clarity that felt like a metronome. Michael notified the partner named in his operations agreement that he would amend terms to require compliance or he would walk. He chose the path of correction with teeth. He sent me the notice he served, and for the first time he did not dress the document in pride. He let it be what it was, an instruction to do better now. The third thread arrived in my inbox at sunrise. Kayla Pierce published a correction on her site with the kind of plain language that lawyers appreciate. She removed a post that had spun my work into a story that did not resemble the facts and replaced it with an explanation of how a source fell short. She acknowledged our letter and apologized to readers for the noise. No drama. Just cleanup. The internet does not often run on humility. When it does, I take a picture in my head and file it under rare weather. By Friday afternoon, my email chimed with a message from Michael addressed to me and copied to Stephen and Victor. He apologized to the team at LaRouge for turning a room built for grace into a stage for his ego. He apologized to me without flattery. He attached a 90-day remediation plan that looked like someone had been doing the math out loud. Weekly cash flow forecasts with receipts attached. A calendar to shorten receivables and a contact list for vendors who would trade terms for loyalty. A staffing plan that brings payroll in line with revenue over the next 2 cycles. A policy to ban off-the-clock work with a place for employees to report violations without fear. A simple code of conduct written in words any busser could read in a minute. He asked for scheduled checkpoints. He did not ask for praise. I wrote back with dates and times and nothing else. A weekly email every Monday by noon with numbers to match the plan. A 15-day check on tangible movement. The 30-day cure review with documents ready for a third party to verify. If the plan held, the lease would be safe. If it did not, the contract would speak. That night I stopped by the restaurant before service to drop off a printed copy of the commission's decision for the office file. The dining room was quiet lights, low, the smell of stock and citrus alive in the air. In the kitchen, Tomas ladled staff soup into bowls and laughed at something a line cook had said. Stephen stood with the schedule in his hand and a pen behind his ear. He nodded at me and said in that way he had, that things were in motion and people were doing what they said they would do. It is the closest thing to a prayer I believe in. I walked back out to Harbor East and let the wind lift my coat. The water caught the last of the day and sent it back in broken bands. My phone buzzed one more time. David sent a short note that the settlement terms looked sound and that he was proud of Rosa for taking the first step. He added that he was ready for the cure review and would keep his tone level. I smiled at the screen and put the phone away. By the time I reached my car, the week had settled into its proper places. The commission had spoken. The partner had signed. The blog has been corrected. Michael had written a plan and asked for structure. I unlocked the Accord and sat for a minute with my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the water. Then I started the engine and pulled into the slow evening traffic, steady as a tide moving toward shore. A week later, I walked back into LaRouge and felt the familiar warmth rise to meet me. The reservation sat on the screen at the hostess stand under Michael Carter. Lena smiled and led me to a table near the pass where the light is kind and the sound of the kitchen feels like confidence. Michael was already there. He wore a plain blue shirt with the sleeves buttoned and no shine on his wrist. He stood when I reached the table and nodded like a man arriving to work rather than a stage. Richard came in a minute later with David at his side. Richard moved carefully, but he moved without help. David's hand hovered near his elbow and then dropped when he saw there was no need. Victor crossed the floor to greet us with a quiet hello that steadied the room, and Stephen set the pacing with a glance to the captain. Chef Tomas looked up from the pass and gave a small salute with his spoon. It felt like a house taking a breath and holding it just long enough to welcome the guests it has come to care about. Michael began before the first course landed. He did not raise his voice. He said that last week he had tried to lift himself by pushing me down and that he was wrong. He said he had started the work to repair what was in his control and that he understood the cure period was a promise with teeth. He looked at me, then at Victor and Stephen, and then back to me. He said he would bring numbers on time and that his plan would meet the dates I set. I told him that correction is the only road back to trust. No speeches, just that. David let out a breath and tapped the table with 2 fingers, the way he does when he agrees without wanting to make a show of it. Richard said nothing. He watched my face and then Michael's, and something in him loosened that had been stiff for years. The kitchen sent a simple first course as if to underline the simplicity of what had been said. A salad with citrus and a clean finish that reminded me of clear lanes. Claire poured a modest wine for the table and left my glass at a polite whisper. I reached for water and felt its familiar weight cool in my hand. We ate in an easy quiet that did not need to hide from anything. Halfway through the meal, a couple paused at the edge of the table with smiles that belonged to people who have built a life together. Vivian and James Roth thanked us for the champagne that found them last year on their anniversary and said it tasted like someone remembered what mattered. I told them I was glad to be a small part of their story and asked which corner of the room had become their favorite over the years. They pointed toward the window where the harbor throws its light against the glass, and I said that was a good choice because the room seems to hold its heart there. They wished our family well and drifted back to their table like a small benediction. Stephen kept the pacing in that way he has, where nothing clacks and nothing stalls. The courses moved, and the conversation stayed simple. Michael spoke when asked and left space when he should. He did not touch his cufflinks because he was not wearing any. Richard tasted the main course and then said it was very good and left it there. David asked me whether the hearing room had felt fair, and I said it had. Victor passed by and asked if we were comfortable, and I told him the room fit just right tonight. When the check would have come, Stephen placed a simple folio for my review and then gently lifted it away with a smile. House policy, he said with a tilt of his head that needed no words. We stood together at the front, and the evening felt complete without the kind of flourish that keeps you awake later than you mean to be. Outside the night had cooled, and the harbor lights stitched the dark together. At the valet stand, Tony stood a little taller than last time. He thanked me for the scholarship in a voice that knew you do not get many moments like this and should carry them well. I told him to focus on his classes, sleep when he could, and treat every station with respect. He nodded like a young man turning a promise into a timetable. He brought my accord around with a careful hand. The Aston stayed where it always is on nights when I want to leave the world untouched. I sat in the driver's seat and let the engine settle into its even hum. Michael walked up to the edge of the curb and said he would send the first Monday report on time. I said good and left it at that. Richard lifted his hand in a small wave that carried no performance. David said he would see me at the review and would bring coffee. The door closed with a familiar click and the car felt like itself again. I pulled away from the canopy and eased into the traffic that moves like a slow river along the water. Justice in my life has taken a different shape than I imagined when I was young. It looks like laws followed contracts, honored facts named in plain words, and compassion held steady without turning into rescue. It sounds like a kitchen bell and a door that opens and closes without drama. It feels like the weight of a set of keys that still belong in the palm of my hand. If this story met you somewhere true, I would love to hear what healthy boundaries and real justice look like in your family. Share your thoughts in the comments, and stay with me for more quiet victories where good people win by keeping their heads clear and their hearts kind.